Deep Sea Embers Chapter 311 to 320. The elderly father worried about his children's daily lives and wanted to sneak a peek at his son's activities at home. So, at 12:30 into the night, he saw his son set up a stage on an icy island base and watched over a dozen girls perform belly dances. Talk about a shocking revelation and baptism into fatherhood. At that moment, Tyrion flew into a dumbstruck panic. Truthfully, his current sense of horror and the chaotic thoughts racing through his head even surpassed the time when he heard that a No. 3 submersible had appeared near Frost a few days ago. The infamous pirate captain in the cold sea awkwardly moved aside, attempting to use this clumsy method to block Duncan's view, but he saw another ice-covered wall light up beside him. The father's figure walked directly to another mirror and continued to watch the stage. "Aren't they cold?" Tyrion instinctively replied, "Cold, but they can endure it with a special alchemical potion." Tyrion. Duncan turned his gaze back and looked at Tyrion, who had become as rigid as an ice sculpture. "Don't be so tense, you're already an adult, and it's your right to have any hobbies. However, this hobby is somewhat surprising. Does your sister know?" "It's not what you think." Tyrion couldn't help but exclaim again. This time, compared to his previous outburst, there was even more helplessness and despair. "Please don't mention it to her if you ever have the chance to contact her in the future." "Oh, it seems she doesn't know." Duncan nodded. "Indeed, it's better not to inform Lucretia about this." Tyrion. "What do I have to say for you two?" Duncan laughed. He could clearly see Tyrion's expression at that moment and had heard his previous outburst. He simply found it amusing. Witnessing such a reaction from the top pirate in the cold sea was not an everyday occurrence, and it would be a shame to miss such a fantastic scene. The instant Tyrion saw the smile on Duncan's face, he understood. He was first taken aback. His father was joking with him, a somewhat cruel joke, but one that had been missing for a long time. Immediately afterward, he controlled his astonished expression and swiftly turned serious as if his previous lapse in composure had never occurred. "If you're done having fun, let's discuss business," the formidable pirate sighed and said reluctantly. "I don't believe your late-night visit is merely for joking with me. I came across a ship." Duncan's expression also turned serious and he got straight to the point. "The Obsidian. Do you recall this name?" "The Obsidian." Tyrion frowned initially, searching his memory for well-known ships on various routes, finding nothing, but then his expression shifted slightly. "You mean the Obsidian? I know only one Obsidian, but it should have sunk already." As Duncan anticipated, no one would know the ship's situation in this cold sea region better than a pirate leader who had been firmly established in the northern area for half a century. And if it were a ship that had sunk due to a maritime disaster, it would leave an even more profound impression on Tyrion's mind. Since shipwrecks resulting from maritime disasters are regarded as the most ominous events on the vast ocean, captains may not pay attention to other vessels, but they will undoubtedly want to know the names of those sunken ships, the cargo they carried, their actions, and their whereabouts. "It's that one, the sunken ship that's been submerged for 6 years, Duncan nodded. "It has resurfaced, entirely transformed into a strange entity, with inverted cabin structures, mud-like living substances, and a captain who is neither human nor inhuman." As Duncan finished speaking, Tyrion's eyes gradually widened, and after a brief reflection, the renowned pirate's face showed a mix of astonishment and seriousness. He did not doubt, for he knew his father would not deceive him at this time. On this matter, he wouldn't engage in such a trivial act. However, he still found it hard to believe because the situation had entirely exceeded his expectations. "Doesn't it sound familiar?" Duncan's voice continued to emanate from the ice as if carrying the chill of the cold sea. "It's somewhat reminiscent of the No. 3 submersible situation but more severe. It's a replica that has returned from the deep sea, and what has been distorted is not only the crew inside but also the ship itself. You were involved in the Abyss plan, so I want to hear your judgment." "My judgment," Tyrion began but then realized something else. "Wait, where did you encounter that ship?" He suddenly reacted. The Obsidian had sunk near Frost, so theoretically, the replica should have surfaced around Frost too. How could his father have encountered that ship? Duncan, in the ice, revealed a faint smile. "Are you at a high enough vantage point?" "A high enough vantage point?" Tyrion looked around, somewhat puzzled. The terrain here is not bad. The port area is generally elevated. Is there anything obstructing the view to the southwest? No. Oh, look in that direction and wait a moment. Tyrion instinctively looked towards the island's southwest, a gentle slope with terrain slightly inclined towards the sea. The main residential facilities of the port area were situated on this slope, which ended at the coast. A few kilometers beyond the coast lay the dense fog and turbulent currents enveloping this secret base. Something flickered in the thick fog. Ads by PubFuture. It was a ghostly green flame, rising and glowing like a specter in the fog. Tyrion blinked. After a while, he heard a distant, muffled, yet undeniably real roar. It was the sound of an ancient muzzle-loading cannon being fired. You're in the cold sea. Tyrion felt his muscles tense, a subtle yet pervasive chill seeming to gradually encircle him. He hesitated and turned back to look at Duncan in the ice. You found this place. Not easy to find. Your island is surrounded by thick fog, floating ice, and erratic currents. Luckily, the spirit realm is serene with secure roots, Duncan smiled. But don't worry, I won't bring the Vanished directly to your island, that would make your subordinates anxious. The Vanished will hide in the dense fog beside you. Tyrion thought for a moment and suddenly felt that his father's last words were even more unnerving. It might be better to bring the Vanished directly to the harbor. Yet, in the end, he didn't dare say it out loud. For he feared that the moment he opened his eyes the next day, he would see the Vanished's flagpole looming over the harbor. Your expression is tense and disheartened. Duncan's voice suddenly emerged. Did I cause you any trouble? No, I didn't mean that. Tyrion quickly responded, trying to adjust his expression as he continued. It's just that things are a bit unexpected, and I'm still not used to interacting with you. As he said this, he paused and hastily asked before Duncan could speak again, why did you suddenly come to the cold sea? It's not just to give me a surprise, is it? Some things happened. Duncan nodded. A person who should have been dead for years suddenly sent a message from Frost, which piqued my interest. Upon arriving here, I quickly saw the obsidian, which confirmed my suspicions. Now I suspect that the lingering remnants of the Abyss Plan are stirring beneath Frost. The Abyss Plan. Tyrion's cheek muscles twitched uncontrollably as memories flooded his heart, some from half a century ago, some from recent events. The sudden news from his father was like a sharp blade, slicing open the veil that had only been slightly lifted. Tyrion abruptly realized that what was happening was far more complex than he had imagined. It wasn't just a number 3 submersible, not just a dagger island, and beneath Frost's deep sea, the Abyss Plan was not only reviving. I think your suspicions are correct, he said, his expression troubled. There truly is an issue beneath Frost. The obsidian you encountered is not an isolated incident, do you know? Just recently, Frost authorities salvaged something from the nearby sea area. The voice in the ice fell silent for a few seconds. Judging by your expression, I think I can guess what it is. Yes, the number 3 submersible, the 8th clone. It has now been sent to a desolate island near Frost called Dagger Island. The authorities have designated it as a military-restricted area, attempting to uncover the secret of the clones, Tyrion said, shaking his head. But that's not the only news. Recently, there have been rumors of the dead returning to life in Frost. It is said that the dead suddenly broke free from their graves, and even people who had died or disappeared for years suddenly appeared on the city streets. However, there are also conflicting reports that they are just ordinary city residents and that the overly anxious church guards are indiscriminately arresting passers-by during curfew hours. Tyrion shrugged. The information on Dagger Island is difficult to obtain due to the news blockade. As for the situation in Frost, I do have some informants. According to their reports, strange things have indeed been happening in the city recently, and unfamiliar faces have been coming and going. But as for the dead returning to life, I don't think there's much credibility to it. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. No one understood the boundary between life and death better than Tyrion and his undead sailors. The god of death, Bartok, had a door that anchored the boundary between life and death. In short, once the soul of the living passed through that door, it would enter the world of the dead, and the door was one way. In other words, as long as one did not pass through that door, neither a temporary corpse reanimation nor a persistent undead curse could be considered a true resurrection. Many people in the world confuse undead with dead, even thinking that the former have exploited a loophole in the god of death's door. Tyrion turned his head, looking at the noisy sailors on the square, and spoke calmly, but in fact, they are just souls polluted and rejected by that door, stuck at the boundary between life and death. According to the strict concept of the Church of Death, undead actually belong to the world of the living. Duncan didn't speak for a moment but recalled his own experience in the cemetery. Waking up in the coffin, being called a restless one by the cemetery caretaker, a group of annihilators came to steal the corpse, seeming to have anticipated that the body would stir. The sudden self-collapse of the body, as if reaching some kind of limit. Frost may not have experienced a real resurrection of the dead, but there may indeed be witnesses to the dead appearing in the city, and behind these incidents, it is very likely related to a group of annihilators, Duncan said slowly after pondering. But it's hard to say how much they have infiltrated and what they want to do. Annihilators. Tyrion was surprised, not expecting the matter to suddenly involve cultists. How can you be sure it's related to them? They tried to take a corpse from the city-state cemetery, appeared well prepared, and even anticipated in advance that the body would stir. Although the actual situation was a little different from what they expected. Tyrion listened, his gaze shifting between doubt and surprise, looking at his father. How do you know this information? And in such detail. That corpse was me, Tyrion. What? Just an evening stroll when I happened upon the grave robbers. Duncan didn't elaborate further. That's not important. What's important is whether the return of the dead incidents are related to the deep sea beneath Frost. Return of the dead and the deep sea. Tyrion frowned, having never associated the two things before. Hearing his father suddenly mention it, he couldn't help but be puzzled. Why do you say that? What's the connection between these two things? It's simple. The body I borrowed experienced a bizarre collapse in the end, and the state it presented during the collapse was very similar to the clones that appeared in the Abyss plan you described. The state during the collapse. Tyrion's tone was surprised, followed by confusion. But the clones of the Abyss plan come from a depth of 1,000 meters below the sea. How could the dead in the city be related to that place? He stopped, his face becoming complex and solemn. After a moment, he raised his head. Could it be that this replication power has already spread within the city, and the cultists you mentioned are the promoters? But there shouldn't be any connection between the cultists and the deep sea. Listening to Tyrion's muttering, Duncan suddenly thought of another matter. In the depths of the obsidian, in the mouth of Captain Christo, that small piece of flesh containing the aura of the Nether Lord. If the ghost ship truly came from the deep sea beneath Frost, if Captain Christo, regardless of whether he was a copy or the original, had truly come into contact with the Nether Lord, then the cultists in the city would be connected to the deep sea. Tyrion curiously looked at the reflection in the ice. Father, what are you thinking about? What do you know about the Nether Lord? And the cultists? Duncan suddenly asked. How much have you dealt with them? I haven't dealt with them much. Although the Annihilators aren't as elusive as the Enders, they're still a low-profile and mysterious group. They're obsessed with researching demonic knowledge and purifying themselves through it, generally not involving outsiders. Tyrion shook his head and continued, as for the Nether Lord, I heard that its status is equivalent to that of a deity but without the authority of one. In a few descriptions, it is a massive flesh mass crawling in the depths of the Abyss realm, guarding a great rift to subspace with countless tentacles. However, there are also claims that it is actually stuck in that rift, sealed there by some great power. Information on this subject has always been vague and bizarre since mortals in the world have almost no means to observe the situation in the Abyss realm. All research in this area is based on indirect observation of spiritual projections and the soul interrogation of certain cultists. At this point, Tyrion couldn't help but ask curiously, why did you suddenly bring up the Nether Lord? In the deepest part of the obsidian, I found a small piece of flesh that most likely came from the Nether Lord. Tyrion. His astonishment tonight had clearly exceeded the number of times his father had been surprised when he saw 12 belly dancers dancing on stage earlier. "I know you don't believe me, but it's true." Duncan could see the disbelief on Tyrion's face. "I have a shadow demon here that can help identify it." Tyrion still sounded bewildered. "A shadow demon? Help identify? A dark hound? You've seen him before," Duncan casually said, "although you only caught a glimpse at the time." Tyrion paused as if remembering something and then touched his forehead. Duncan nodded. "Yes, that's the one." Tyrion didn't know what to say. Duncan looked up, his gaze passing over Tyrion's shoulder, looking in the direction of the square. After several rounds of dancing, even the dancers who had taken the potion in advance needed to rest. "The conversation should end now," Duncan suddenly said. "This matter seems more complicated than you and I imagined. It's difficult to come to any conclusions through this kind of discussion separated by a mirror." "You mean, I'll send a messenger to you. The messenger will take you to the Vanished. Here, we can talk more conveniently and let you see for yourself the things I brought out from the depths of the obsidian." Going to the Vanished. Despite the calm invitation, Tyrion couldn't help but feel a chill and tension. He tried to control his facial expressions, but his momentary reaction still caught Duncan's eye. "Ads by PubFuture. If you don't want to, I can come directly," the voice in the ice said indifferently, "but that would require you to prepare your subordinates first." Tyrion's expression was somewhat tense. To go to the Vanished himself or to let the Vanished enter the Sea Mist Fleet's base? Both options seemed challenging, but after a brief weighing of options, he made a rational decision. "Send the messenger. It'll be more convenient for me to go there." Tyrion looked openly at his father in the ice. Reason told him that if his father had truly regained his humanity, then even the Vanished returning from subspace, theoretically shouldn't be a dangerous forbidden place. What was there not to go to? He only needed to prepare himself mentally, but if he let the Vanished enter the port directly, then more than just him would need to be prepared. He just needed to confront a little bit of nervous instinct. "That's good," Duncan nodded, seemingly satisfied with Tyrion's answer. He then took a slight step back, and his figure quickly faded and blurred in the ice. "I'll leave first, there's still some business to attend to. Before the messenger departs, I'll notify you." Tyrion slightly bowed in front of the ice that was gradually returning to normal. When the last trace of green flame disappeared, he stood up straight. He then collected himself, turned around, and walked towards the square. On the square, the late-night hustle and bustle had not yet subsided. The undead sailors were either feasting or talking merrily, and some rude people near the stage were trying to whistle at the dancers, but because of leaks in their mouths or throats, they could only make funny sounds. On the stage, the dancers had finished their performance. Under the direction of their leader, they stood in a row, seemingly waiting for the next dismissal order. The cold wind blew through the gaps between the bonfire and the windbreak, and several of the girls seemed to be shivering. In their numb and dull eyes, lively expressions gradually began to emerge. The effects of the alchemical potion were about to end, and normal emotions would return to their minds. Two of the girls gradually showed a bit of curiosity on their faces, but fear was what emerged in the eyes of many more. The undead in various strange shapes and forms across the square. Even with mental preparation, this was not a scene that ordinary people could bear. First mate Aiden ran out. He had been keeping an eye on the activity on the stage and now came directly to the highest point of the square. With a hoarse voice, he shouted at the sailors who were still making a commotion, "Disperse, disperse. No more dancing. Those with the scariest faces, cover them up. Those with missing arms and legs, crawl under the tables. The girls are leaving. Clear the path beside the stage, Wylan. You get under the table. Your face scares me just looking at it." The sailors on the square responded loudly, covering their faces and hiding where they could. Amidst the noise and laughter, the dance troupe leader on the stage first looked at the scene, somewhat bewildered. Then, realizing what was happening, she hastily and awkwardly bowed to Aiden and quickly led the girls off the stage. The girls, with tense and fearful expressions, tried to hide behind others as they hurried towards their temporary accommodations. However, two exceptionally brave girls deliberately stopped, blinking curiously at the undead on the square. One girl even looked up as she passed Aiden, saying something with a smile that made the first mate feel incredibly awkward, almost falling off the platform. Once the dancers from Cold Harbor had left the scene, Aiden finally noticed Tyrion, who had come to the square. Ads by PubFuture. Noticing the captain's unusually solemn expression, Aiden jumped down from the stage. "Captain, what happened?" "An invitation I cannot refuse." Tyrion glanced around and sighed. "Tomorrow or the day after, I may have to leave here for a while." Aiden's eyes widened. A message was sent to the island. Just now. And, how could there be an invitation you can't refuse in this cold sea? Tyrion sighed again. "It's my father." Aiden blinked, hesitated for a moment. "How long will you be gone, approximately?" "I should be back soon, in a day or two." Tyrion didn't mind the subtle change in Aiden's tone. His mind was filled with complicated thoughts, and he didn't have the energy to say anything else. "A messenger will come to the port to take me to the Vanished. Keep this matter quiet for now. In my absence, you will be in charge of everything." Aiden immediately bowed his head in compliance. "Yes, Captain." Then, the first mate paused for 2 seconds, seemingly hesitant, before he couldn't help but look around and approach Tyrion, whispering, "Is he nearby?" Tyrion thought for a moment, then patted Aiden on the shoulder. "The Vanished is hidden in the mist around us." Visibly, Aiden's muscles tensed up. "Captain, after not breathing for so many years, I finally know what cold means again today." First mate Aiden's voice became noticeably cautious. "Are you sure the old captain just wants to meet with you?" "I don't know, and I don't want to know, but my instinct tells me that this journey should be safe," Tyrion said softly, then looked back at the square where the sailors were still unwilling to disperse and planning to party until sunrise, before turning back to the first mate. "But the other sailors may not think so. You know what I mean." Hearing the captain's solemn words, Aiden slowly nodded. He knew what his captain was concerned about. The Sea Mist fleet was vast, and apart from a few ordinary people who were bought or hired by contract as peripheral members, most of the fleet's members were undead, like himself. Strictly speaking, these undead sailors could be divided into 2 groups. A large portion of them were former Frost Navy members, who had once been loyal to the Frost Queen. They were ordinary people who, after the Frostbite Rebellion, gradually transformed into their current state as they remained devoted to the cause. In the endless battles over half a century, in the constant skirmishes with the rebels, death and the curse of the Sea Mist itself turned them bit by bit into the undead sailors they are today, becoming part of the Sea Mist fleet. The other small group of sailors were the true, original backbone of Iron Admiral Tyrion's forces. They were former members of the Vanished fleet. Duncan Abnomar was their old captain. They had witnessed the transformation and fall of the Vanished, experienced the storms of the past century, and had once followed Tyrion in loyalty to Frost. These sailors loyal for a century were known as the First Phase, while those loyal for half a century were called the Second Phase. Aiden himself, as well as the half-witted old priest with a sunken head, were members of the First Phase. A century of experience allowed Aiden to see many things hidden beneath the surface. The Vanished and Captain Duncan held different meanings for the 2 groups of sailors, and the same news would evoke complex and uncontrollable reactions from them. And now, even Captain Tyrion couldn't be sure of the true state of the Vanished and the old captain, let alone whether this state was genuinely stable for an extended period. So until the situation was clear and controllable, news of the captain's visit to the Vanished could not be released. Otherwise, the island would undoubtedly be plunged into chaos. Just then, Tyrion's voice came again, interrupting Aiden's thoughts. "Tomorrow morning, send the dancers back to Cold Harbor." Send them back tomorrow. Aiden didn't know why the captain suddenly mentioned this. "Are you dissatisfied with them?" "The Vanished is nearby, and it's best not to let ordinary people near the island for now." Tyrion shook his head, making up an excuse. "After all, the shock of seeing my father was too embarrassing to mention." He paused, then added, "But you did remind me of something. Sending them back directly might cause that harsh, curved blade Martin to chastise the girls. I'll write a letter later, and you'll give it to the head of the dancers." Aiden immediately bowed. "Yes, Captain." Tyrion nodded and then seemed to remember something. "By the way, when I came earlier, I saw a dancer stop and say something to you." Based on your bewildered expression, what did she say to you? Aiden was somewhat embarrassed for a moment. She said my head shape is very sexy. Tyrion blandly eyed the first mate's shiny bald head. Cold Harbor's dancers are indeed passionate and unrestrained, passionate in personality and bold in aesthetics. Darkness, loneliness, coldness, silence. An endless barren wasteland stretched out in the darkness, with no plants or animals in the wasteland, only jagged rocks and bizarre ruins that had been weathered and decayed for countless years. They stood in eternal silence in a desolate atmosphere, with strange phantom lights occasionally flashing across the sky, sometimes illuminating the wasteland and sometimes casting mottled, twisted shadows on the ground. A hollow shadow was trekking through the wasteland. He didn't know how long he had been trekking, nor did he remember his name when he set out. He only remembered that he seemed to have embarked a very long time ago, and the faint impressions left behind told him that he should have reached his destination by now, and should have been resting in some peaceful place. What caused the delay in his journey and compelled him to persist in traversing this desolate land? The obscure, empty specter contemplated, but soon his sporadic thoughts were consumed by a larger void, leaving him to instinctively progress onward. Unexpectedly, he faltered. Had he tripped on something or bumped into an unseen obstacle? Ads by PubFuture. The empty specter glanced down at himself and observed that colors began to emerge on his indistinct form. He lifted his gaze and pressed forward. As more colors materialized on him, his previously vaporous, wavering surface took on more solid details. Clothing manifested on the human-like dark mist, a sailor's attire. Slowly, he acquired a face, that of a black-haired man in his middle years. His strides grew firm and nimble, and the jagged stones beneath his feet appeared to have somehow leveled out. An increasing number of memories surfaced from the depths of his being. First came his name, followed by the moment of his death, his radiant youth, his hazy childhood recollections, and the scattered, warm glimpses from his infancy. He journeyed toward the edge of the desolate land, and in the darkness, shadows of varying sizes materialized, silently fusing with him. These appeared to be individual entities that had been ripped away and separated from him, now returning to their rightful places one by one. Suddenly, the figure halted at the road's end. Cristo Babelli gazed up in astonishment, realizing he had unwittingly ventured onto a magnificent avenue bordered by ancient stone pillars on both sides. At the avenue's conclusion, an enormous, regal door embellished with elaborate designs hovered in midair. The door stood ajar, yet its interior remained obscured and undefined, concealing any details of what lay beyond. A powerful urge arose from deep within his soul, to cross through that door and find solace on the other side. The middle-aged man dressed in a captain's uniform instinctively advanced. There was no one nearby, but it felt as though innumerable souls were treading the same path toward the imposing door. In the mortal realm, the deceased departed every second, yet before this solitary gate of life and death, the souls seemed incapable of seeing each other. However, just as he was about to make contact with the door, Cristo came to a halt. A towering figure materialized suddenly before the door, obstructing his way. It was a guardian, draped in bandages, donning a somber, ornate robe, a hood, and wielding a lengthy staff. The sentinel of this realm. Cristo gazed at this nearly 3-meter-tall giant, with slight apprehension as memories from his mortal existence surged back, granting him the capacity to communicate with others. "Are you, the sovereign of death?" "No," the guardian replied, his raspy, deep voice emanating from beneath the bandages. "I am merely his emissary." Cristo's voice carried a hint of sadness. "I am not deserving of passing through this gateway, am I?" He remembered even more specifics, including the context of his own demise. Nonetheless, the majestic guardian simply observed the soul at the entrance for a moment before stepping aside slightly. "Please enter, your debt has been settled." To the east of Frost, at the brink of the sea cliff as far as one's eyes could reach, a towering rocky island was visible. It was slender and arched, resembling a thin, curved blade or an oddly shaped dagger. The entire island was blanketed in rough rocks and barren sandy soil, leading the people of Frost to name it Dagger Island, based on its form. In the vast, limitless ocean, land was the most valuable asset for habitation. Even the most desolate and narrow solitary islands were utilized by people, and Dagger Island was no exception. The island had sources of freshwater but lacked arable land or extensive flat terrain. As a result, it couldn't function as a stable dwelling or grain-producing region, and no useful plants or animals existed. However, the island once possessed a modest amount of ore deposits. The people of Frost constructed mining fields and refineries on the island, and after the ore was extracted, it served as a transit port for some time. Following the Frostbite Rebellion, the routes around the city-state were modified, and the island's port was repurposed into specialized storage facilities for housing dangerous items that needed to be kept at a distance from the civilized world. As the years passed and circumstances evolved, this desolate island strewn with peculiar rocks changed ownership multiple times. Now, under the control of Frost's military, it had become a clandestine, temporary research base for investigating the enigmatic object retrieved from the ocean depths. The sealing mechanisms for storing hazardous items and the stringent security measures on the island provided robust assurances for such research. At midday, a mechanical speedboat departed from Frost towards Dagger Island, nearing the military port on the island's recessed side. The flag on the speedboat signified its association with the Frost Navy. After completing a series of intricate and rigorous verification, detection, and registration processes, the speedboat named Sea Swallow was granted permission to dock. As the steam core gradually reduced its rumble, the vessel moored beside the pier and extended a gangplank. Several soldiers clad in blue and black Navy uniforms disembarked first, followed by a tall and sturdy officer with short gray hair. A number of military personnel stationed on the island were already awaiting their arrival onshore. The robust officer with short gray hair surveyed the pier and then proceeded ashore along the gangplank. The waiting personnel promptly approached and saluted. One of them spoke, "General, you are 25 minutes behind schedule. This must be documented and explained. You are required to visit the registration room in person." "Understood." The sturdy officer, addressed as the general, nodded. He didn't take offense at an ordinary non-commissioned officer speaking these words to him, a general, since this was a special research facility, and all stringent approval regulations were standard and justifiable security measures. "We'll proceed immediately. How is the professor's situation?" "Professor Maelson is in the secret chamber. He found something while analyzing and testing a new batch of samples. It appears that the material scraped from the object's surface exhibits unusual properties under specific experimental conditions," the liaison officer explained. "However, the particulars will be discussed after entering the secret chamber." "Very well. Guide me to the registration room." Not far from the Dagger Island military port, in a bay on the inner side, intensive and bustling research was underway in a robust building constructed from reinforced concrete and massive rocks. This seemingly mundane and inconspicuous building was the so-called secret chamber, and also one of the most secure and structurally sound laboratories on the island. The building's interior hall was brightly illuminated, revealing a large hexagonal room with each wall made of the sturdiest concrete. At the top of the walls, symbols and religious imagery with mystical significance were engraved. Large scripture banners hung from the ceiling, suspended amidst the gas lamps' shadows. Steam pipes crossed the ceiling, with some valves softly hissing. Incense burners burned quietly in the corners, their sacred smoke slowly blending into the air. Researchers in robes bustled about the hall. A metal device approximately 5 to 6 meters in diameter, round and resembling a large bell, hung in the center of the room from thick chains. The metal device's surface was weathered and aged as though it had been submerged in seawater for an extended period. Its intricate valves and connecting structure at the top indicated its function. It was a diving bell. Directly beneath the suspended diving bell, a large circular grate was embedded in the center of the hall's floor. The grate's diameter was significantly larger than the diving bell's long axis, and through it, a faint red glow could be seen deep underground. A tall, slender, and impeccably groomed silver-haired elderly scholar stood in front of the suspended diving bell, overseeing several assistants as they carefully scraped samples from its surface. A clergyman dressed in a priest's robe walked slowly behind the assistants, carrying a brass incense burner. The subtle incense smoke rose from the burner, accompanied by gentle murmurs of prayers, and wafted slowly through the air. "Professor, General Belazov has arrived at the port," an assistant approached and spoke to the tall and slender old scholar. After completing the necessary registration and handover, he will come directly here to see you. Oh, Belazov, I received word that he wanted to come in person. It seems City Hall is finally getting a bit anxious, Professor Maelson said with a touch of helplessness in his voice. Let him come. How are the samples sent to the lab this morning? After the final round of testing, it's now confirmed that although it looks like rust, it's not any known material, and its properties are continuously changing over time, the assistant replied. It feels as if it is still undergoing some evolutionary process, so it cannot consistently display its own properties. Professor Maelson nodded slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on the suspended diving bell. The diving bell's exterior was severely corroded, but the round hatch structure on its side was still clearly visible. The hatch was tightly closed, and since it had been brought into this secret chamber, it had never been opened. On the other side of the diving bell, there was a round window with an incredibly thick piece of specialized glass embedded in it. However, for some unknown reason, the interior of the round window was obscured with grime, and the dark, dirty substances almost covered the entire glass, making it impossible to clearly see the situation inside the diving bell. One could only vaguely make out a disordered cavity inside and something that appeared to be liquid. Ads by PubFuture. What was inside the diving bell? Professor Maelson had been curious about this more than once, but regardless of his curiosity, he had no intention of opening the hatch. The year the Abyss plan began, he was 16. He knew what warranted curiosity and what demanded caution. While thinking, his assistant's voice came from behind. Professor, do you think the higher-ups will order us to open that hatch? Honestly, I don't want to receive such an order at all. Professor Maelson shook his head, looking at his assistant. Courage and the spirit of exploration have allowed humans to survive on the boundless sea, but once these traits are pushed too far, they become recklessness and death. The assistant blinked, then blinked his third and fourth eyes. But our progress is too slow now. What if another submersible surface as you predict? Maelson pondered for a moment and gently shook his head. By that time, I'm afraid we'll have to do more than just open the hatch. We'll have to be prepared to face the deep sea. The assistant seemed to understand, but not quite. The assistant was still too young, but then again, how many people could comprehend the horror of the Abyss plan half a century later? Professor Maelson looked up at the bustling figures surrounding the diving bell. Some of them appeared different from when they first arrived on the island. And some other figures occasionally made the old professor feel somewhat unfamiliar. It seemed that many unknown figures had unconsciously appeared in this research facility. But that wasn't strange, as personnel changes in research teams were normal, especially for complex special projects involving multiple experts. Everything was reasonable. The cleric with a brass incense burner in his hand approached and nodded slightly in front of Professor Maelson. But then the incense burner in his hand opened its eyes slightly, discreetly sizing up the old scholar while letting the wondrous scent of the incense to waft through the air. Today's blessing is complete, the cleric whispered. I will come here again at this time tomorrow to pray for the machines. Thank you, Percent. And Percent at * priest. The old professor smiled and nodded, naturally addressing the other. If it weren't for a bunch of trouble in the afternoon, I'd have to invite you for a drink. Better attend to the general first. The priest laughed. He's a big shot representing Frost who came here to supervise the project. General Belazov stepped into the mysterious chamber. Upon entering the massive building, made of sturdy reinforced concrete and a fusion of colossal stone foundations, the stocky, gray-haired soldier felt an atmosphere of grandeur, solemnity, and deep mystery. This ambiance stemmed from the rune inscriptions scattered throughout the structure and the numerous closed doors that lined the hallways. The pervasive runes functioned as the building's security system, designed to resist supernatural attacks from outside and prevent unwelcome visitors from delving into its depths. However, hidden behind the closed doors were a network of shadowy corridors, each potentially leading to an anomaly containment room, dangerous specimen storage, temporarily unhinged researchers, or ancient archives that were off-limits yet indestructible. Navigating the building was akin to being caught between reality and a chaotic abyss, as if standing on an invisible boundary and gazing into another treacherous world. Even ordinary people without supernatural abilities or spiritual talents might feel their nerves tense and their hair stand on end. Is the security here truly sufficient to ensure that thing won't cause any problems? General Belazov couldn't help but ask as he followed the military scholar leading him past a dark alloy door. The secret chamber facility is Dagger Island's most heavily fortified building. Each room has individual security and supernatural barriers, and any object with a danger level above 3 is directly connected to the furnace below, the head scholar proudly stated. Even without considering the supernatural barriers, the building's structural integrity could withstand a full-scale attack from a saint-level adversary. It is impregnable unless an ancient deity decides to exert its power here. After a brief pause, the leading scholar continued, moreover, despite the unusual nature of that thing, it has proven to be much more stable than initially expected, even docile. Stable, docile. General Belazov unconsciously furrowed his brow and inquired. Yes, although it might not be entirely accurate to describe it that way, the guiding scholar nodded. For several days now, it has been suspended in the center of the secret chamber. Usually, such peculiar entities would display signs of life and affect their surroundings in various ways, but this one has remained inert. It hasn't emitted any substances, released any energy, or shown any properties beyond the realm of reality. Although samples obtained from it exhibit some unusual physical properties, they remain confined to the physical world. Compared to most other hazardous items of the same level, it is as docile as a rock. That's a fascinating situation. I'll report it to the city-state's executive officer, General Belazov casually commented. A researcher in a blue coat approached from the opposite direction, briskly walking past. As he passed the general, he respectfully nodded but continued without stopping, causing a soft, squelching noise reminiscent of the wriggling limbs of a soft-bodied creature. Everyone here seems to be quite busy, General Belazov remarked casually. Yes, the secret chamber is always bustling. Our work isn't limited to analyzing the diving bell. We also oversee other aspects of the facility, the guiding scholar responded with a shrug. Please excuse any perceived impoliteness. It's fine. I'm not concerned with formalities, the general said, his brow furrowing slightly. Is it just me, or is there a strange smell in here? I've noticed it since I arrived. It reminds me of the scent of a sea creature. This is the bay area of Dagger Island. The building's ventilation system connects directly to the outdoors, so such a smell is expected. Moreover, the odors from disinfectants and sedimentation tanks add to the scent, the guiding scholar explained, sighing. We've been meaning to request funding to renovate the ventilation ducts, but the higher-ups always say, if it works, it's fine. The general refrained from commenting further, instead looking up at the end of the corridor. Professor Maelson was already standing at the door. Tyrion checked his coat and hair one last time in the mirror before moving away and approaching a nearby shelf containing a few items. He pondered for a while, deciding what to bring with him. Should he take his sword, his gun, his amulet? Weapons seemed impractical, as neither a sword nor a gun would provide reliable protection on the vanished. Furthermore, he was invited as a guest aboard the ship, and carrying weapons could seem insincere and potentially provoke his father. The amulet might not offer any tangible advantages, but it could provide emotional reassurance. However, he was unsure about his father's current views on the gods. Would he scorn them, or merely be indifferent? For the first time, the most renowned pirate leader in the cold sea found himself deeply troubled about setting out. He was going to the vanished, or more accurately, he was returning to the vanished. That was where he spent his childhood, where most of his cherished memories resided, and where the aspects he both longed to avoid and confront existed. After a century apart, he suddenly found himself unable to imagine his appearance when he stepped onto that ship. At that moment, First Mate Aiden's voice interrupted Tyrion's thoughts from outside the door. Captain, are you ready? Tyrion scowled and called out, almost ready, don't rush me. I mean, you should hurry. Aiden's voice returned, now tinged with urgency. For the sake of Her Majesty the Queen, the messenger is here. The messenger is here. Tyrion was taken aback, only then noticing the strangeness in Aiden's tone. He hurried to the door and opened it in one smooth motion. Aiden's voice continued to echo outside. Captain, if you don't open the door soon, I'll, Thank goodness, you finally opened it. Tyrion stared in amazement at the scene in the doorway. Ads by PubFuture. His unwavering first mate stood rigidly there with a terrifying skeletal bird shrouded in green flames perching atop his bald head. Meanwhile, on the chest of the skeletal bird floated a bronze compass in midair. He recognized it as his father's possession, Anomaly 022, Spirit World Compass. Captain, can you stop staring and help me get this bird off my head? Aiden's voice trembled. These flames keep landing on me. The skeletal bird tilted its head, seeming to study Tyrion. Suddenly, it opened its beak and produced a peculiar female voice. Go to Chunghwa Avenue, walk to Urxian Bridge, get on. There are seats, big seats. Move back a bit, peanuts, beverages, and mineral water. Tyrion was startled by this sequence of sounds, and his first thought was, how could his father's messenger be like this? Next, he considered the strange words that had just emerged from the bizarre bird. After pondering for a moment, he remained equally perplexed. It wasn't until he noticed Aiden was on the verge of passing out that he came back to attention. Let's go. Tyrion shook his head, forcibly pushing aside the jumbled thoughts. He stopped thinking about how to confront his father upon reaching the vanished ship. Adopting a go-with-the-flow attitude, he glanced at the odd skeletal bird. How do we? Before he could finish his sentence, the enormous bird suddenly soared into the air, stepping on Aiden's head. It then dove down, and with a burst of green flames obscuring his vision, Tyrion heard an odd scream. Your father is coming. The next moment, he experienced the world spinning as if all his senses were being scrambled and reassembled. He then felt his whole being hurled into the sky, traveling through darkness and cold. Right now, time seemed to lose its meaning, and this peculiar disorientation and detachment vanished abruptly. The sensation of solid ground returned before he knew it, and the darkness and weightlessness dissipated. Sunlight filtered through the thin mist and bathed him once more. As his familiar senses reappeared, the landscape before Tyrion's eyes gradually came into focus. There seemed to be a tall figure standing before him. But it wasn't his father. Compared to his father, this figure was far too slender, resembling a woman. She looked familiar. Tyrion blinked hard, ultimately sharpening his vision, and recognized the person in front of him. Long white hair flowed over her shoulders, a scar marred her left eye, and she was a tall, beautiful woman. Vanna, wearing a peculiar expression, looked at the pirate captain, then awkwardly glanced at the spectators anticipating the spectacle. Finally, she sighed and said to Tyrion, Captain Tyrion, I know you have many questions. Before Vanna could finish, Tyrion recoiled in astonishment, his eyes wide as he gazed at the Inquisitor lady. He conquered planned. The most renowned pirate leader in the Cold Sea was in shock. The atmosphere on the deck suddenly turned somewhat awkward as an inexplicable silence shrouded Vanna and Tyrion. The latter's astonished expression hadn't yet subsided, while the former was already covering her forehead with her hand. This silence was eventually disrupted by a voice from nearby. A few meters away, Shirley nudged Nina with her elbow. You see, I told you the first sentence would definitely be that. You owe me 2 scoops of ice cream. Fine, you were right, Nina grumbled. 2 it is, I'll get them for you at Frost. Shirley's eyes widened instantly. I'm not an idiot. Eat ice cream in a freezing place. Let's wait until we get back to planned. Tyrion blinked, only now noticing the others on the deck and the subtly different atmosphere from what he had anticipated. He first spotted the girl named Shirley, whom he had encountered before, and then observed the enigmatic hunting dog lazily sunbathing at her feet. Next to them was another girl who appeared to be 16 or 17 and a white-haired, distinguished elderly man. Everyone was smiling. Behind these individuals was the deck of the Vanished, the railing, the mast, and the sails. The faded and fragmented images from his childhood, the memories of siblings playing together, and all the pleasant and unpleasant impressions seemed to gradually emerge from a dark, hidden cavern and slowly regain their vibrancy in the sunlight filtering through the mist. Though there were a few unfamiliar faces, the ship remained as he remembered it, not the somber, dilapidated, chaotic ghost ship he had initially envisioned. At the very least, the deck still appeared quite familiar. Tyrion knew he was daydreaming and understood that he ought to say something at this point, but he couldn't prevent his thoughts from wandering. He was aware of his tendency to daydream since childhood, and each time he daydreamed on the deck, his father would suddenly materialize from somewhere behind him and scold him, "Tyrion, what are you daydreaming about?" The pirate captain visibly shuddered, and the momentary confusion between memory and reality even made his mind freeze for a few seconds before he hesitated and turned around to see a tall, commanding figure standing behind him. It wasn't a phantom reflected in a mirror or a hazy silhouette seen through distant seas and gunfire, but an individual standing face to face. "I'm sorry, Father," Tyrion said instinctively, "I got a little lost in thought." Duncan frowned. He wasn't certain if it was an illusion, but he constantly sensed that Tyrion's current state was quite delicate, significantly different from the impressions their previous encounters had left, yet somehow familiar. However, he soon felt reassured. After all, this was their first direct conversation after a century apart and the first time returning to this ship, so it was only natural for Tyrion to have such a response. Simultaneously, Vanna, who had been quiet and uneasy for a while, finally spoke up. "Captain Tyrion, concerning my presence here, I need to clarify. First of all, the situation isn't what you think. I came to the Vanished because I was assigned by the church." Church assignment. Tyrion was even more astonished than before and immediately turned to look at his father. "You." "I didn't overthrow the church." "Hold your thoughts, Tyrion," Duncan interjected before he could continue, aware of what he was thinking. "Do I need to stress it again? I am not an enemy of the civilized world now. You should approach me more calmly rather than being on guard as if I were a catastrophe ready to unleash chaos at any moment." "Tyrion. I'm sorry. I accept your apology. Let's converse as we walk." Duncan gestured and strode towards the rear of the deck. "Concerning Miss Vanna's presence here, the Obsidian situation, and Dagger Island, we have much to discuss." He then turned back and waved to the onlookers nearby. "Those not involved, carry on with your tasks and cease crowding around here." Tyrion, somewhat perplexed, trailed Duncan, heading towards the captain's quarters he recalled from his youth. Meanwhile, Vanna walked silently on the other side. Memories and present surroundings intermingled and detached, occasionally overlapping and sometimes creating a stark contrast. Upon returning to the Vanished, everything appeared to have veered off the anticipated path from the outset. Tyrion instinctively surveyed the ship's state, seeking elements that matched his memories and searching for a figure who should, in theory, be present. Duncan, naturally, observed his subtle actions. "Are you looking for Alice?" Tyrion hesitated momentarily before recalling that it was the name of the puppet girl. He had always assumed she still went by Ray Nora. "Ah, yes, is she on board?" "She is, but she's likely occupied in the kitchen at the moment," Duncan nodded. "Alice is responsible for the meals on board, so you can sample her cooking today. We have fresh vegetables, recently caught fish, and rarities on typical long-distance sailing vessels." "Meals?" Tyrion unconsciously echoed the word, nearly blurting out, "Father actually eats human food," when, suddenly, a series of exclamations and frantic footsteps emerged from nearby, disrupting his daydream. "Help, help, 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 help." It was Alice's cry. Tyrion gazed in amazement towards the sound's origin and saw the Gothic puppet sprinting across the deck nearby, brandishing a kitchen knife in her hand and a wooden barrel filled with carrots and greens bounding behind her. Duncan impassively observed Alice racing around the deck as Nina and Shirley attempted to assist but failed. Ultimately, a barrel of vegetables chased the trio and a dog around the deck. He turned back and patted Tyrion's shoulder. "Occasionally, things can become quite lively here." Tyrion faced him again with a puzzled expression, his mouth twitching a few times. "Are the ingredients on the ship overly fresh?" "It's due to the barrel. It has its own opinions about storing vegetables, so it often clashes with Alice's ideas." Ads by PubFuture. "Do you not require assistance?" "No need, Alice is open-minded. But it seems like she's asking for your help." "It's all right, I'm open-minded too." Tyrion's expression appeared somewhat stiff, as if even commanding an entire undead fleet as a pirate leader, he still couldn't quite adapt to the daily rhythm of the Vanished. However, Duncan wasn't surprised by this. He simply patted Tyrion on the shoulder. "You have to learn to adapt. If I went to help every time Alice cried for help, then I wouldn't have time for anything else each day. As it turns out, her adaptability and resilience are actually quite strong." Tyrion wanted to say something, but they had already arrived at the captain's quarters. This was the most memorable place on the entire ship in all his childhood and adult memories. During his childhood, his father's captain's quarters were a mysterious and slightly frightening room. He and his sister Lucretia could play around in most parts of the ship but were strictly prohibited from entering this place. Even the most garrulous sailors on the ship wouldn't hesitate to block the siblings at the door. As adults, their father's captain's quarters became a tense and serious place. Even after they each became captains of the Sea Mist and the Bright Star, Tyrion and Lucretia would still instinctively tense up when stepping in here. Their father formulated all the grand exploration plans here, marked newly discovered islands and anomalies on the nautical charts, and completed the planning and scheduling for the entire fleet. Most of the time, Tyrion and his sister were only responsible for listening and executing orders. Their father did not appreciate the opinions of others. In his memory, he was a resolute and stubborn man. The door opened, and the dim interior environment, unlike the deck, appeared before Tyrion. The next second, his gaze fell on the edge of the navigation table, on the pitch-black and peculiar goat head. The black goat head, with a wooden texture, creaked as it turned, its hollow and deep obsidian eyes staring fixedly at the visitor who entered the room. "Hello. Nice to meet you, Mr. Tyrion." Tyrion was startled and turned his head subconsciously. This is the current first mate of the Vanished, someone you can trust," Duncan introduced. "You can simply call him Goathead." First mate. Tyrion blinked, then looked back at the peculiar, wood carving. Suppressing the strangeness in his heart, he accepted his father's explanation and cautiously greeted, "Hello, Goathead, sir." Goathead shook its neck as if to say something, but the next second, Duncan interrupted it smoothly, "Quiet down and stay silent while we talk." Tyrion looked at Duncan in astonishment. When conversing with it, you must be familiar with the process of interrupting beforehand. Don't let it speak without restraint, that's my advice. Heeding his father's warning, Tyrion's expression quickly grew serious. For the formidable Captain Duncan to treat Goathead with such caution and solemnity, it must indeed be as strange and dangerous as it appeared. Naturally, Tyrion regarded Goathead as an extremely hazardous anomaly, and silencing it was apparently the containment requirement for this anomalous object. As Tyrion spent more time on board the ship, he discovered numerous discrepancies between his memories and the present reality. For instance, there were animate objects scurrying about the vessel. Additionally, there were ethereal spirit sails that had lost their tangible form, now resembling gossamer fabric floating on the mast. Moreover, there was an odd sculpture in the captain's cabin, which his father called Goathead. Tyrion sat across the navigation table, observing the eerie objects in the room. Many of them were familiar, albeit aged. His father faced him, recounting the events that transpired between the Storm Church and the Vanished, while the young inquisitor from Planned occasionally chimed in. The situation had evolved beyond his expectations. A secret envoy. The legendary pirate echoed the phrase Vanna had just used, his expression a mix of intrigue and concern. "The Storm Church is more audacious than I thought. To be honest, I was taken aback at first," Duncan admitted with a smile. "The Storm Pope is a mysterious figure. It's hard to discern how much of her speech is sincere and how much is influenced by the Church's interests or the directives of the Storm Goddess Gomona. Nevertheless, this turn of events aligns with my intentions since I do require a liaison to engage with the 4 divine churches and an assistant proficient in handling cultists." "Handling cultists, you say?" Tyrion mused thoughtfully. "I recall you mentioning the annihilation cultists and the evidence discovered on the obsidian." Duncan nodded gently. "That's why I brought you here." He retrieved a tobacco box from his pocket and, upon opening the lid, revealed its contents to Tyrion. "This is the clue I found deep within the obsidian, the Netherlord's flesh." Tyrion involuntarily held his breath. Despite knowing he should be safe with his father nearby, he couldn't suppress a shiver of apprehension when the box was opened. Inside, he saw a piece of flesh, the size of a thumb. An overwhelming sense of dread and revulsion washed over him, akin to the primal reaction one might experience when confronting a ferocious beast unarmed. Even though the flesh was lifeless in the metal container, Tyrion felt as if he were being scrutinized by a living, formidable, and intimidating entity. Swiftly averting his eyes, Tyrion realized that he was drenched in cold sweat. Are you all right? Duncan observed Tyrion's state and furrowed his brows. Why is your reaction more intense than Morris and Vanna's? Still reeling, Tyrion replied almost reflexively, they didn't react as much. We experienced resistance and a sense of danger, but nothing as extreme as your reaction, Vanna clarified from the side. What did you feel just now? Tyrion conveyed his earlier sensations and then examined the piece of flesh with a furrowed brow as numerous thoughts raced through his mind. I'm unsure if it's just an illusion, but it felt like this thing was watching me intently, he explained, as though it's still alive, or something, beyond, it is casting its gaze. Duncan and Vanna shared a knowing glance. Bringing Tyrion here had indeed been a wise decision. Without direct interaction, certain subtle cues might have remained hidden. This piece of flesh, believed to be a remnant of the Nether Lord, exhibited a unique reaction to Tyrion's proximity and attention. Could your involvement in the Abyss plan years ago be the reason? Duncan speculated, considering the plan to be Tyrion's most distinctive connection to this incident. Tyrion remained silent for a moment, reflecting for a few seconds before raising his head. Can you confirm whether the obsidian truly journeyed to Frost's deep sea? I cannot, as there's no concrete evidence, but my intuition tells me it returned from there. Duncan answered honestly, the ship's behavior closely resembles the replicas you described. Tyrion said nothing for a while, his eyes fixed on the small, dark iron box on the table, seemingly contemplating and weighing his choices. After an indeterminate period, he suddenly inquired, may I take another look? Are you certain? Duncan peered into Tyrion's eyes, this could be dangerous. If the Abyss plan indeed forged a link between you and this thing, each contact you make with it strengthens that connection. Tyrion was quiet for 2 seconds before a faint smile emerged on his face. On your ship, things shouldn't spiral out of control, right? If something does arise, I'll handle it. Duncan nodded slightly, sliding the small iron box he had just retrieved back toward Tyrion. Exercise caution, and inform us right away if anything occurs. Tyrion nodded, took a deep breath, and once more focused on the Netherlord's mysterious piece of flesh. Almost instantly, the feelings of opposition and tension resurfaced, accompanied by the sensation of being observed by an imposing presence. The overwhelming power established a connection, engulfing his mind like a tidal wave, and Tyrion's survival instincts nearly compelled him to shut his eyes. But this time, he forcefully resisted his instincts, neither looking away nor actively disrupting or challenging the will that materialized in his mind. Through this prolonged persistence, Tyrion finally confirmed his earlier suspicion. Adds by PubFuture. The will and power radiating from this Netherlord's flesh were astonishingly non-threatening. The fear, danger, and resistance he experienced stemmed solely from the natural law induced by the immense power. The gaze concealed beyond the flesh was actually quite benign. Tyrion's heart stirred, and he raised his head, ready to share his discovery with his father. However, in the next instant, Tyrion found himself enveloped in darkness and chaos. The familiar cabin and its occupants had vanished from his sight. Astonished, he stood up, instinctively reaching for a weapon, only to realize he was unarmed. He cautiously surveyed his surroundings, attempting to see clearly amid the darkness and turmoil, but it was as if his vision had been obscured by a veil of shadows. Even when he held his hands before his eyes, he could only discern blurry outlines. This was potent mental interference. His consciousness was being guided and disrupted by something. Yet, he sensed no hostility. Feeling disoriented in the darkness, Tyrion suddenly thought he detected a sound. A rustling movement emanated from behind him, indicating that something enormous was shifting, and a faintly cold breath neared the nape of his neck. Tyrion's heart clenched, and he swiftly turned his head. A massive, peculiar limb adorned with faint blue patterns intermingled with dark brown extended before him in the darkness. The limb, resembling a tentacle but spanning hundreds of meters, rose like a supple pillar in the darkness. The amorphous bulge at the tentacle's tip hovered less than a meter from Tyrion's face. Further along the limb, an even more colossal, indescribable structure gradually emerged from the shadows. It appeared to be a mountain, a city, or a chaotic entity capable of instantly driving mortals insane. It could not have originated from the real world, nor could it have been the creation of any rational deity. The structure resembled some deep-sea mollusk, a fusion of starfish and squid. But the following instant, its misty surface began to roil, sprouting innumerable tentacles, limbs, eyes, and throats that continuously morphed. In this fleeting moment, Tyrion's eyes nearly bulged from their sockets, and tumultuous thoughts surged through his mind. He was unsure whether he felt fear or had momentarily lost the capacity to scrutinize his emotions. He simply gazed at the undulating tentacle before him as though it was attempting to communicate or convey information. Nevertheless, he could not comprehend the cacophony intertwined with the tsunami of data. Numerous eyes opened on the tentacle's surface. As Tyrion stared into them, it seemed as though he finally heard some intelligible information from those eyes in the distant, mountainous, main body. Run! Boom! A horrifying roar detonated within his mind as if an immense repulsive force was tearing his spirit asunder and forcibly hurling it back into the real world. Tyrion nearly lost consciousness immediately, but just when he believed his soul would shatter amid the boundless darkness and chaos, a flicker of green flame materialized in his line of sight. The flames roared, engulfing him and dissolving the terrifying imagery. Before he had a chance to react, the dreadful illusions and sounds had dissipated like a dream. He was once more in the captain's cabin aboard the Vanished. In the following moments, Tyrion found himself immersed in the brief chaos and fatigue that ensued from the enormous impact. Struggling to focus his vision, a barrage of sounds overwhelmed his mind as they twisted and churned from the raging storm. Yet, in spite of this, his rational mind remained clear. He realized that the ghostly flames emanating from the darkness were what kept his sanity intact, preventing it from being corrupted by the enigmatic power of the Nether Lord. Gradually, he managed to steady his breathing. As he hadn't experienced severe mental pollution, the illusions in his mind quickly dissipated. At the same time, he heard a composed voice from the other side, "It seems you've recovered." Tyrion lifted his head, looking at the towering figure across the navigation table. "It was you who pulled me out just now. You stared at it for too long." "Vanna said you were succumbing to a nightmare," Duncan stated calmly. "Fortunately, I've recently studied interfering with dreams." "A nightmare?" Tyrion instinctively rubbed his brow. "Did I appear to be falling into a nightmare just now?" "It seems you had a remarkable experience." Duncan's tone was inquisitive. He had indeed interfered in Tyrion's spiritual state, but unlike the usual scenes he saw when using the power of the spirit realm to enter someone's dreams, he didn't see anything this time. Tyrion's nightmare was only darkness, as if the source of the nightmare had left before he intervened, which further aroused his curiosity about the events that occurred. "I encountered an indescribable entity." Tyrion recalled the visions he had just witnessed, carefully depicting them. "I can't describe its exact form and don't dare to remember every detail, but I think it was the Nether Lord." Tyrion recounted what he had seen and experienced in the darkness, providing details about his various spiritual encounters. Apart from being unable to accurately remember the full silhouette of the mountain-like shadow, he held nothing back. Upon hearing Tyrion's story, Duncan's brow furrowed. "So you're saying that the only message this Nether Lord conveyed to you was to run?" "Strictly speaking, it was the only thing I could understand." Tyrion spread his hands. "It seemed to say much, but everything was drowned out by the overpowering noise. Eventually, it appeared to give up and spoke the shortest word I could barely discern." Duncan pondered. "So when a person is in a state of heightened inspiration, they can't hear the whispers of the ancient gods?" Tyrion didn't quite comprehend. "Father, what are you talking about?" "Ah, it's nothing, never mind." Duncan dismissed the thought with a wave of his hand, returning his focus to the issue at hand. After thinking it over, he turned to Vanna. "Do you believe Tyrion encountered the Nether Lord? Could it have been trying to protect him by telling him to run?" Based on Captain Tyrion's account and his emotions, even if it wasn't the Nether Lord, it was at least an entity similar to a heretical deity, Vanna promptly replied. "As for the run aspect, I apologize, Mr. Duncan, I can't make a hasty judgment." During the ensuing conversation, she hesitated briefly, as though feeling her answer was not sufficiently accountable, and added, "Information about the Nether Lord has always been scarce, with even the 4 major churches possessing limited knowledge. The prevailing belief is that the Nether Lord is an enormous, singular entity located at the core of an abyss in the deep sea. It lacks the ability to move or exert its power in the real world. It can't communicate and seems not to think, like. Vanna tapped her temple, seemingly struggling to find the right words to describe such a being, and Duncan casually remarked, like a mass of slime submerged in the deep sea. Alive, vast, but neither thinking nor moving. You might be the only person in the world to refer to the Netherlord as slime, Vanna said with an unusual expression, but she nodded gently. Indeed, as you mentioned, if the information we've obtained from the tormented souls of demons and heretics is accurate, the Netherlord is such a silent heretical god. Its sole activity is to continuously create more shadow demons from its body or absorb those who have perished in battle. Duncan couldn't help rubbing his forehead. It sounds like some sort of fungal mass. The captain was once again using an incomprehensible, subspace dialect. However, Vanna was no longer surprised by this, and she ignored the unintelligible words and smoothly continued the conversation. In general, the Netherlord can actually be considered a relatively benign heretical deity because it has never shown any intent to encroach on the real world. Nevertheless, it is still classified as a wicked god by the four divine churches. So, regardless of its subjective awareness, its mere existence poses a threat. Yes, whether it's the shadow demons that emerge from it or the fervent annihilators who have formed contracts with the shadow demons, they all pose a significant danger to the civilized world. Duncan remained silent, deep in thought. For some reason, what came to his mind at that moment was the black sun that sustained the false corona and was dying in the flames. However, he only considered it briefly and refrained from forming any opinions about the nature of the Netherlord, for a simple reason: insufficient evidence. He would not draw conclusions about matters he had not personally experienced. Tyrion massaged his temples. The noise in his head had completely dissipated, leaving only slight dizziness and fatigue as though he had been awake for several nights. As Vanna shared information about the Netherlord, he pondered his own thoughts. Whether the run indicated goodwill or not, one thing is certain: the Obsidian's current situation is clearly a result of the Netherlord's power, and now there are annihilators active in Frost, likely involved in this matter, Tyrion said slowly. If the influence I just experienced is genuinely connected to those who participated in the project back then even the Abyss project is now tied to this issue. Moreover, I believe our primary concern at the moment should be Dagger Island, the lingering aftermath of the Abyss project from half a century ago. The 8th, number 3 submersible, Duncan said gravely. How much do you know about the situation on Dagger Island? There is currently a military restricted area there, and even with the Sea Mist fleet's capabilities, approaching it is difficult. The Vanished might be able to force a landing on the island due to its unique nature, but locating the submarine in a short time could prove challenging. After all, the island is vast, and the research facility has a complex structure. The military personnel on the island may directly order its destruction in an emergency situation. Duncan listened and sensed that something was off, so he quickly interrupted the pirate leader. Hold on, when did I say we were going to break in directly? Tyrion paused for a moment and suddenly realized, I'm sorry, father, I thought. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan waved his hand, indicating that there was no need for an explanation. Let's not discuss this, just give me a brief overview of what you know about Dagger Island. It might be useful. All right, about that small island. Belazov gazed solemnly at the diving bell suspended in the center of the hall. He had been in this research facility for 2 days, and during that time, he spent half of it in the hall, working with the diving bell. He was not a professional researcher and didn't understand the mechanical aspects or the significance of the various physical and chemical tests that scholars had conducted on the samples. He stayed here simply because of his curiosity about this mysterious, eerie device. An irresistible curiosity. As a Frostian under 40 years old, he had not experienced the significant event from half a century ago, but as a high-ranking official of the city-state, he had at least learned about the Abyss plan from confidential files. The third submarine held the most critical position in all files, and it was the most terrifying aspect of the entire Abyss plan. Rusty and dirty inside and out, it hung quietly on an iron hook resembling a piece of scrap iron that appeared unremarkable. Professor Maelson stood beside the general, explaining the laboratory's safety measures. The rope below leads directly to the furnace. In case of an emergency, the hook will release instantly, and the submarine will crash through the grate and fall into the furnace. On the other hand, suppose the release device is activated but the submarine doesn't fall into the channel. In that case, a connected mechanism will initiate, and the entire room will be detached from the vault frame and slide into a cave behind the bay, filled with nitroglycerin explosives. What about the personnel in the laboratory? We have 30 seconds to evacuate. After that, the evacuation passages will be locked, said Professor Maelson. However, in the worst-case scenario, the person in charge, which is me, can choose not to open the evacuation passage. Belazov nodded slightly and slowly approached the diving bell. He looked at the dirty circular glass window, curiously peering inside. Dark red muddy sludge swirled slightly inside the submarine, and something resembling an eyeball pressed against the glass window, looking at Belazov through the gaps in the dirt. After a while, the general withdrew his gaze. It's pitch black inside, I can't see anything. Yes, we haven't opened its hatch yet, Professor Maelson nodded. So naturally, we cannot clean the inside. General Belazov smiled, as it should be. Belazov had completed his inspection of Dagger Island and supervised the research work. Now, it was time for the military representative to leave. Near the pier at Dagger Island Bay, Professor Maelson, who had personally come to bid him farewell, watched the Seagull as it prepared for departure. Sailors were boarding the ship, port officials were checking procedures, and robed clergy with incense burners in hand strolled near the ropes, gently swinging the incense as they prayed for the ship's machinery. The weather was clear, making it a perfect day for sailing. Belazov stood on the dock, observing the sailors as they boarded the Seagull one by one. He then spoke to Professor Maelson. Professor, I commend your research efforts, but I must remind you that the project's progress on Dagger Island is slow, and some individuals in the city-state are growing impatient. The old professor calmly replied, I have been instructed to investigate the various properties of the submarine while ensuring safety, attempt to decipher its material composition, and strive to understand its operating principle in the next stage. We are currently following the schedule. If the higher-ups in the government are truly concerned, they can try to locate the blueprints left by the Frost Queen and construct the fourth or even fifth submarine. It's much more efficient for someone to descend directly than for us to collect samples in the lab daily. They won't appreciate your response, but I'd be happy to relay it on your behalf, General Belazov chuckled. They won't dare to build a submarine, and their reactions will be even more amusing. Professor Maelson shrugged and fell silent for a moment before speaking with a complex tone. Joking aside, I must admit that I am also concerned about the progress of this matter. Belazov remained silent, observing the experienced old professor who had lived through the Queen's era. Collecting samples and analyzing their physical and chemical properties daily are indeed essential components of the standard research process. However, as you've witnessed, there is only so much we can deduce from those samples, the old professor sighed. Even if we manage to open that hatch someday, I fear we won't uncover any more secrets from the submarine. The true secret isn't here, General, you know what I'm implying. Below a kilometer, Professor, your thoughts are somewhat perilous. Maelson sighed. I assumed you, as a soldier, would be more prone to such dangerous thoughts than me, a scholar. My responsibility is to safeguard the city-state's security, which makes me more inclined toward a cautious and conservative approach, Belazov stated calmly. So, do you actually intend to reactivate those submarine devices? You meant resuming the Abyss plan, didn't you? The old professor chuckled and shook his head. Don't worry, I haven't been that reckless. Nevertheless, there's an inescapable truth. The crux of the matter lies beneath the deep waters, and a laboratory replica of a submarine bell won't solve any mysteries. We might genuinely need to consider a backup plan, not necessarily diving proactively, but in the event a 9th or even 10th replica emerges, we should at least be prepared with countermeasures. I will relay your suggestion to the government office. General Belazov hesitated for a moment and took a gentle breath. Until a clear directive is given, the secret chamber project will continue as planned. The old professor nodded. Thank you. The Seagull departed. The steam-powered ship cut through the tranquil waves, leaving an elegant wake that extended across the vast ocean. Dagger Island's steep and winding coastline gradually receded from sight and slowly vanished into the thin fog typical of northern waters. On deck, Belazov shifted his attention from the island and made his way to the captain's quarters. Although Dagger Island was not far from Frost, traveling between them still took several hours. During this monotonous journey, he needed to organize his thoughts and consider how to report to the city-states leaders about the third submarine and how to present Professor Maleson's suggestions. The Abyss Plan, this half-century-old case had left a chilling legacy that had slowly become an unspoken taboo, but now that new replicas were emerging from the depths, perhaps it was time to adopt a more proactive strategy. A sailor stood near the captain's quarters and nodded to the general. "The steam core is functioning properly. We will arrive at Frost Harbor number 1 in 4 hours. Belazov glanced at the somewhat unfamiliar sailor and nodded gently. "I need to rest for a bit. Do not disturb me unless it's necessary." "Yes, General." Belazov entered the captain's quarters, sat at the desk, and listened to the low hum of the machinery emanating from the floor below. Finally, he exhaled a sigh of relief, knowing he would be back on the main island soon. Gathering his thoughts, he casually opened the desk drawer and retrieved the notebook he had concealed in the hidden compartment. There had been no irregularities during his visit to Dagger Island, and the return trip had proceeded smoothly. Nonetheless, certain procedural matters could not be overlooked. These were both orders and responsibilities. Upon opening the notebook, the first sentence that stood out to him was, "Even if everything appears normal, confirm your sanity and judgment. Even if nothing seems suspicious, verify the following content." Belazov flipped through the pages, skillfully performing a series of actions. The sound of pages turning filled the room. "You are left-handed. Confirm this now. Recall a color. Then turn to the next page, it should be blue or black. Keyword, dagger, visualize, and confirm that the image in your mind matches the picture on the next page. Your name, Belazov, try spelling it in the blank space on the next page. On this trip, the accompanying personnel have been reduced. There are only 32 people on the boat, including yourself. If there is a significant discrepancy in personnel, conduct a roll call immediately. Your deputy on this trip is Benjamin Jordan. He has a burn scar near his right eye." As Belazov flipped through the pages, performing simple recollections, confirmations, or subconscious repetitions, his movements suddenly stopped. His gaze landed on the final sentence of the page in the notebook. "A burn scar near the right eye." Belazov quietly repeated the sentence, a sense of inexplicable uncertainty stirring in his mind. "The right eye. Ads by PubFuture." He slowly closed the notebook, returned it to the hidden compartment, and calmly stood up to open the door of the captain's cabin. "Benjamin," he called out to his adjutant. A middle-aged officer quickly emerged from a nearby room and approached Belazov. "General." Belazov examined Benjamin's face, only to find one eye in the center. A faint sense of discord throbbed in his heart, and Belazov's rationale told him that what he saw seemed incorrect. However, a hazy veil appeared to envelop his thoughts, and he couldn't pinpoint the issue, feeling that everything was logical. This subtle inconsistency in his consciousness gradually made the general more alert. He stared at Benjamin for an extended period, attempting to locate the source of the discord in his heart until the adjutant's voice reached his ears again. "General. Is something wrong?" "Benjamin, how many eyes should a person have?" Belazov suddenly asked. The adjutant momentarily froze, seemingly bewildered by the question. Observing this, Belazov quickly spoke. "Never mind the question, it was just a passing thought. Go back to your room and rest. I'll go downstairs and take a look." Though puzzled, the adjutant nodded. "Yes, General." The one-eyed man named Benjamin returned to his room, appearing entirely normal. Belazov watched his retreating figure, sighed with relief, then turned around and swiftly walked to the end of the corridor. He knew he had been slightly reckless just now. He shouldn't have posed such an odd question to someone who seemed a bit off, even if it was one of his most trusted adjutants. But without that inquiry, he couldn't verify the existence of the strangeness he had faintly sensed. Now, he was certain. Something was amiss on the ship, and something, concealed and dangerous, had come aboard. He quickly walked through the corridor and arrived at the sailors' mess hall, where he was met with surprise and unease at the man's sudden appearance. Belazov's gaze swept over everyone present, then waved his hand and quickly headed to the bridge. People were there too, and many more people were on deck. Yet, the Seagull had only 32 people on this streamlined journey. The number of people was incorrect, very, very incorrect. However, the thought that everything is normal persisted in his mind as though it were battling against the discordant facts that had already surfaced. Belazov stood on the stairs leading to the engine room, calmly observing the descending slope. The conflicting thoughts were battling, but he no longer needed to fret over the minute differences between the two. There were still over 2 hours left until they reached Frost, meaning he still had some time. He took a gentle breath and proceeded to the engine room in the deepest part of the ship. The final corridor leading to the engine room was stuffy and dim. The incessant and irritating mechanical vibrations and roaring sounds seemed to burrow into one's brain, and the lights on the walls appeared to be affected by unstable air currents, causing the flames inside the lampshades to flicker. However, these were nothing compared to the increasing sense of unease and tension and the dizziness caused by the gradual tearing of thoughts. Belazov controlled his steps and his expression. The closer he got to the depths of the Seagull, the more he maintained his steady pace and his expression as calm as usual. Crew members lingered in the corridor, chatting while wearing strange leather coats, with folds of skin piled up on their faces and their voices sounding like buzzing noises. Belazov approached them, and his mind told him that these sailors were his soldiers, but he couldn't recall their names. "General," one of the soldiers stepped forward, curiously looking at Belazov, "do you have any orders?" "I'm just here to check on the engine room," Belazov calmly replied to the unfamiliar soldier, "Stay at your posts." The soldier looked at him, saluted, and stepped back. "Yes, General." Belazov walked through the group of people, his steps steady as usual. He could feel the soldiers' gaze linger on him for a moment, but they quickly turned away. Were they really his soldiers? Were they the crew of the Seagull? Were they the hidden entities? Or were they some kind of minions? Had they noticed? Or were they already on guard? Would these soldiers, whose names he couldn't remember, pounce on him in the next second? Belazov suppressed all his thoughts until he reached the entrance to the engine room and opened the unlocked gate. An even more piercing mechanical noise rushed toward him. The steam core was running at full power, brewing an astonishing surge of energy within the spherical container. A complex piping system hissed on the ceiling of the engine room while massive connecting rods and gears quickly rotated in the steel frame at the end of the chamber. The machinery seemed to be running very happily, even happy to the point of fanaticism. It was as if a restless soul was driving the heavy steel gears to spin rapidly, pushing the ship towards the civilized world at its limit. The hissing sound from the steam pipes seemed to be mixed with indistinct whispers. Belazov's body swayed slightly, but he soon steadied himself and walked towards the steam core. A priest was waving incense in front of the valve. He suddenly turned his head and looked at the general entering the engine room. The church emblem pinned to his chest seemed to be smeared with a layer of grease, making the sacred symbol on it blurry. "General." The priest looked at him curiously. "Why did you suddenly come here?" "This place is. I came to check on the steam core," Belazov said, his eyes falling on the sensor in the priest's hand. The small, fleshy orb swayed gently in the air, its pale eye opening wide at the general's presence. He raised his head again, looking at the running steam engines and the hissing pipe systems. The gas escaping from the steam pipes had a bloody hue, and the edges of the rapidly spinning gears were blurry and distorted as if something was parasitizing this massive machine, replacing the originally sacred steam with its malicious soul. The machine had been contaminated, in a state of desecration. This thought flashed through Belazov's mind for a second, but it quickly disappeared. Nevertheless, he still walked toward the control panel of the steam core. Even though the colossal, steel heart seemed normal in his eyes at the moment, he slowly reached out his hand to the control panel. "General," a greasy mechanic suddenly walked over from the side, reaching out his hand to block the control lever. "Don't touch these, sometimes machines can be quite fragile." Belazov looked up at the mechanic. The latter just calmly met his gaze. But suddenly, the mechanic's lips wriggled a few times. Belazov frowned slightly, reading a few words from the mechanic's lip movements. "The machine is possessed, cannot be shut down or destroyed." Belazov was taken aback for a moment, and then saw the mechanic turn to the side, fiddling with the levers while his lips wriggled slightly. The priest is not to be trusted. Situation out of control. Contingency 22. Contingency 22. Belazov's heart tightened, but soon, he knew what he had to do. The mechanic knew the ship's heart better than anyone else. He turned and left the engine room, not heading to any other cabin, but maintained a calm demeanor after leaving the lower corridor, returning to his captain's quarters. From time to time, soldiers came forward to greet him, some of whom gave him a vague impression, while others he could not remember their names at all. There must be still sane and normal human beings among these soldiers, but Belazov had no way to distinguish them, nor the time to contact or discern the other 30 humans on board besides himself and the mechanic. He locked the door to his captain's quarters, went to the safe by the desk, and began turning the combination lock. With the crisp and pleasant clicking sound, his fingers grew increasingly pale from the force. As the latch opened with a soft click, the safe door opened. Belazov's gaze skipped over the compartments where the documents were stored and fell on the red button at the bottom of the box. Ads by PubFuture. Beside the button, a line of small text was marked, Contingency 22, for use only in extreme situations. Belazov reached out for the button, and almost at the same time, he heard a knock on the door. "General, are you in there? We have received instructions from Frost, and they need your personal attention." It was the voice of his executive officer. A moment of hesitation suddenly surged in Belazov's heart about the possibility of him making a wrong judgment. What if there was actually no problem on the ship, and the only problem was with himself? What if he had suffered mild contamination, causing cognitive and memory biases and even hallucinations all the way? If that was the case, he was about to bury an entire ship for his own paranoia. "General, are you in there? We have received orders from Frost." The knocking on the door grew more urgent. Suddenly, Belazov snapped out of his thoughts, realizing that those ideas might not be in line with his character. He wasn't the type of person to hesitate at the final step of an action. Someone was injecting impurities into his thoughts. Damn heretics. Without any hesitation, Belazov immediately pressed the red button. After an extremely short delay, a terrifying explosion engulfed the entire ship. The mechanical ship Seagull was instantly enveloped in a flash of light and flames, torn apart by the powerful blast of explosives. The burning wreckage of the Seagull floated on the surface for a while before being gradually pushed towards the northern waters of Frost by the ocean currents. Eventually, the fiery remains began to sink faster, as if being dragged down by some invisible force, disappearing entirely beneath the waves. Simultaneously, within the Frost City state, near Cemetery No. 3, an elderly, slightly hunchbacked caretaker wearing a black coat was slowly making his way back from the city district. He had just bought some daily necessities from a nearby street and was now hurrying back to his post before his shift change. The path to the cemetery was quiet and secluded, with few passers-by. Even so, the few who did pass by would unconsciously adjust their pace to keep some distance from the somber, hunchbacked old man. It wasn't that they disliked the caretaker, rather, they instinctively felt a touch of fear. This wasn't solely due to the eerie atmosphere surrounding the cemetery, it was also because of the old man's cold and reclusive nature. Even when compared to other caretakers in the cemetery, who were also somewhat gloomy, this old man from Cemetery No. 3 was the most intimidating. He had been at this post for so long that he seemed to have absorbed some of the aura of the dead. This even led to terrifying rumors. People often claimed to see pale lights floating above the cemetery fence at night, suggesting the caretaker's soul had already left his body. Others said that the frightening old man would lie down in a coffin at midnight, stopping his breath to join the dead, only to awaken when the sun rose the next day. These eerie and horrifying rumors surrounded the cemetery and its caretaker, but the reclusive and eccentric old man seemed to have never cared. In fact, he hardly interacted with the nearby residents, spending most of his time in the caretaker's cottage within the cemetery, only occasionally venturing out to purchase daily necessities like he did today. Naturally, he saw nothing wrong with this. Keeping the living away from the world of the dead, ensuring the former didn't harbor excessive curiosity to avoid harm, and allowing the latter to rest in peace was his responsibility. He guarded the cemetery, as well as the city outside it. The old man looked up at the cemetery gate not far away and suddenly stopped. Today's situation seemed a bit unusual. There was a small visitor.